time that Angela was called to serve in Brescia, the city was suffering severely from the ravages of the war between the Habsburgs and the French. The war had a very deleterious effect on the social and political life of the city. The life of the organized church in Brescia, as in other northern Italian cities, was in a state of decay. The bishops rarely visited their dioceses. Most of the priests were either not present in their parishes or were leading a dissolute life. Seminaries and monasteries were places of laxity and ignorance. It was here that for the first time Angela encountered the devastation of war and the much deeper destruction caused by living immoral lives. At the same time, she also encountered in Brescia a serious religious revival movement that was supported by the laity and promoted by the city officials. The movement gave rise to fraternities and other organizations that had spiritual renewal as their goal. One of them, the Company of Divine Love, founded in Genoa in 1497, would prove to be important to Angela because 3 members of this company played an important role in the foundation of Angela's company. They were Caterina Patengola's nephew, Girolamo Patengola, Agostino Gallo, and Gallo's friend, Giovan Antonio Romano. Within a few years, Angela was surrounded by a group of young men and women as their intellectual center and moral compass. It was in her encounters with these young people that Angela experienced what a difficult situation women were in if they did not live in privileged circumstances. They were forced to live their lives as second-class citizens, subject to the will of their parents or permanent guardians throughout their lives, with significantly restricted choices. In particular, in the turmoil of the time, when cities were attacked repeatedly by armed gangs, many parents were anxious to give their daughters the physical and legal protection of a husband, or to place them behind monastery walls for safety. Since the monasteries were not engaged in any income-producing activities, they required entrants to provide a substantial dowry to ensure their livelihood. Therefore, it was easier for less fortunate families to marry off their daughters. The legitimate aspirations of these young women were often disappointed. Angela became aware of the inner ordeals of many of these young women, especially if they felt the desire for a spiritual life but were forced by circumstances to marry. Also, Angela knew the internal decay of monastic life very well. She began to ask, why couldn't women who were attracted to a life according to the evangelical counsels have the possibility of living outside the cloister walls in the world according to their vocation? From an early age, Angela had an inner vision that God would use her to found a community of consecrated young women. Only in her advanced age did she come to see that this vision could be accomplished. Since the fall of 1533, Angela met women regularly for prayer and religious instruction. By the time that Angela, in 1534, obtained a small room in the church of St. Afra, she had already gathered about her a small group of young women and widows. So in 1535, she was able to realize the official establishment of the community. On the 25th of November, the feast of St. Catherine of Alexandria, Angela brought together 28 of her companions. The foundation ceremony was very simple. The members took part in a mass, following which each of them wrote her name in the book of the community and promised solemnly to live this way of life. From then on, they called themselves members of the Compagnia di Sant'Ursula, Community of St. Ursula. At the same time, Angela was concerned with developing a rule for the community so that the new life form could have legal protection. She discussed her ideas repeatedly with experienced people, but especially with the women of the emerging community. Then she dictated the final text to her secretary and consultant, Gabriele Cozzano. In a long process, as the first independent rule written by a woman for women, the community emerged. Cozzano then presented the rule to the Bishop of Brescia in 1536 and achieved confirmation. The papal confirmation of the rule and the establishment of the community came in the form of a papal bull promulgated in 1544 by Pope Paul III. The new community had a significantly different understanding of itself from the then existing orders, as for example, the Benedictine nuns or the Poor Clares. Angela combined living in the world and religious vows in a way that was never possible before. The first Ursulines did not live cloistered lives, as was usual for nuns, but remained integrated in their families or in their workplace. In her rule, Angela defined the governance structure of their community. The colonnelli were sisters who had jurisdiction over each area. Angela designated them as teachers and instructors in the spiritual life. She also specified a group of matrons or mothers, women who did not belong to the community in the strict sense, but had concern for the welfare and spiritual needs of the sisters, who were to be their spiritual daughters. Angela also specified that certain men were to be on hand to act in capacities denied to women of the time, as attorneys, advocates, and public representatives in critical matters of the community where legal action might be necessary. It is worth noting that Angela did not provide a management office for priests. In the year before her death, she wrote 2 other works, the Aricordi, the Councils, and the Legati, the Testament, both addressed to those who would be leading the community after her death. She directed that each of the leaders should keep in their hearts above all the autonomy and dignity of the young women in their care. Thus, she recommended to them a leadership style that was characteristic of her own. For God has given everyone free choice, and He does not want to force anyone, but only to direct, to invite, and recommend. I advise you, she says, I am not forcing you. She also strongly recommends to the leaders of the community to show every possible kindness, and reprimand and apply rigor only in unavoidable cases. They should act in everything with prudence and balance as the Holy Spirit inspires them. They were advised to make communal decisions and to carry out a thorough review of leadership at their meetings. Encouragement of independent action is typical of Angela, and the fact that it occurs so much in her writing shows how particularly important it was. With the founding of the Company of St. Ursula, Angela breaks down the deep-rooted tradition that is called aut maritus aut murus, either a husband or a convent wall. Nevertheless, the members were understood as religious, members of a spiritual community.